All right, welcome to Chapter 11, our last unit, starting our last unit, 6A. It's Sustainable Communities, Cities, and Regions. So we're starting to broaden the scope of what sustainability means in a larger geographical area. So Chapter 9 dealt with what you could do as an individual. Chapter 10 is how organizations and institutions play a role in that. So now we're kind of expanding out into a community-wide or region-wide sustainability model. So, what is community sustainability? A community is broadly defined as people who often with a diverse characteristics live in the same geographical area or setting. So, I live in Oak Creek. That's sort of my community. Now, in Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee, there's lots of different communities that are around. You have Washington Heights, and I don't even know the names of all of them. There's a ton of them. There's a map out there that'll show you what the names of them are. Now, a sustainable community is one that can come together to understand the role that it takes to become a sustainable, making environmentally sustainable a common goal. So that's through the economy, through the community, through the environment, the community as a whole, understanding what it takes to become a sustainable community. It also minimizes the external impacts of its own actions. So things like reducing waste and stuff like that. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. So, trying to become more insular, like, self-sustaining within the community itself. That doesn't mean cutting yourself off from everything. It just means lessening an impact from any outside influence or having your community affect the outside as well. Now, a lot of this starts with what's called community economic development. And the goal of that is to improve the quality of struggling communities and make them more livable through enhancing economic opportunities, empowering those people that live in those communities to want to make that community better, and improving social conditions. And we hear about this quite a bit, especially in sort of the impoverished areas of cities, trying to revitalize. You hear that term all the time, revitalize areas. Trying to, beautify, invigorate, all of these adjectives that we use to try to get uh, areas better than they are now. Now, one way to achieve this is to kind of start, getting money spent there on simple things. It could be, improving roads, improving sidewalks, aesthetics, planting flowers, planting trees, murals. All these kinds of things play a role in trying to get this area to look and feel like more like a community that people want to live in. Perception is everything. In real estate, it's all about location, location, location. And if you're in an area that's perceived to be, let's say, high in crime, people have a tendency to shy away from that. But if you could show them that, yeah, things happen, but look at how beautiful we've made it, and we're trying to, you're actively trying to get that element out of that community, people have a tendency to say, okay, I'll come in there. I apologize. I think I have allergies today if this sounds weird. And then another approach is to provide grants and tax relief and low interest loans to attract businesses and attract people to come into those areas to get that influx of money, get that influx of influence to want to invigorate that community and make it better. So equitable community economic development, what does that mean? So it's sort of a contract between the community and businesses that require developers to provide specific improvements to existing community, but not just improvements that benefit the community, not some entity outside of that community. Hiring local workers, making livable wages, um, making sure there's affordable housing, and we'll talk more about that in a bit as well. The term is called gentrification. um, Now, what you see there in that picture is, I believe it's in. Oh my God, I forgot now. I think it's Pittsburgh. Oh, it's a solar plant. They built this big plant and it was in an area that was very, very run down and dilapidated and really just nasty. So they cleaned it up. They built something there that's, this huge facility that's going to make solar panels, and so they're with that soul and creates tons of jobs, hiring people from that community that desperately needed jobs, good paying jobs. um, so that is a way to help revitalize, again, areas, impoverished areas. Now these CBAs are between, let's say, a business and a community. The other opposite, or the other part of that, is what's called a CBO, which is community benefit ordinance, where the city is actually passing sort of these government agreements saying, hey, you have to zone this to have affordable housing. You have to do, you have to make sure you have certain number of, let's say, local workers. The contracts for the building and construction need to go to local contractors, things like that. So this is where the term equitable comes from, making sure that if you're going to build here, the community benefits from it. Now, community wealth building is the idea that rather than having the money trickle down, so to speak, from outside entities to, try to build up an area, which typically doesn't work as well. This is where you're trying to build it up from the bottom, where to understand the benefits of business ownerships through worker-owned cooperatives, and this is becoming more of a realization, especially in areas that really need the help. What you see in the background is Cleveland, Ohio has done this a little bit. And what they've done is the model starts by identifying anchor institutions, typically like universities or hospitals, in these areas, in places that, they're not going to move. You're not going to just college isn't just going to pick up and move. So you build around that. Sometimes these colleges are in not the greatest areas, so they build around it, and this often keeps the jobs local. And these cooperatives often support sustainable and green initiatives because they owe it to themselves to understand, hey, if we're going to do this, let's do it right. Let's make sure that we're employing local people that benefits the economy, and sustainable practices, which helps everybody. The worker-owned businesses near these institutions help meet the needs locally. And you see this all the time. I work at UWM. That's my main day job. And you see all these businesses that pop up around universities. Now, that's not exactly what this is. This is trying to take an area that really needs that influx of community spirit, community, build wealth building. That's exactly what it is. It needs that money, and those cooperatives to help build up and raise wages and get people out of poverty. And that's what this whole idea is. It's a bottom up approach to take an area that was once, pretty much written off and build it back up again. Now, part of this is housing and community stability. A big problem with economic housing, is that as development increases, so do the incomes of the people, and they have a tendency to flee the distressed areas. So let's say you're building up an area that was really once run down, and things are doing really well. A lot of people have a tendency to say, "Well, I want out now. I got money. We're a bit more stable, so I want to live in a nicer neighborhood." Whatever that means. Well, what happens is when you take those people and those people flee, it's leaving behind an even more distressed area because not everybody might be at that level. So this could be avoided by building up the community as a whole, not just the wealth part of it, but things like getting businesses to come in, retail spaces, open spaces, parks, anything you can do to entice people to stay in that area. Another huge issue is what's called gentrification. I can't say that word apparently. Gentrification, where once development begins in distressed areas, the problem is the land values and the rents and everything else go way up because the people that are moving in are not the people that once lived there, but they have more money. They're coming in. You see this downtown all the time. Um, The cost of rent increases and home values, and it basically displaces the low and moderate income residents, which completely contradicts the social equity objectives of sustainability. So you're basically building all these nice buildings and then basically kicking out the people that once lived there. And that's not what you want either. And that's really what happened in a lot of downtown Milwaukee. Um, this can be prevented by including affordable housing. And so part of, I mentioned before in those CBOs or those community benefit ordinances, uh, things like inclusionary zoning, which is sort of requires developers to include affordable housing in new developments. So you can't just put up penthouse type apartments. You have to diversify the development to include both high and moderate low income type housing. um, so that's a huge part of what happens when you're trying to revitalize downtown areas. Now, because of this push, what happens is affordable housing is now being designed with sustainability already in mind. What is it? Why is that? Because sustainable housing the construction costs come down, and then the maintenance costs come down. It costs a lot to own a home. There's maintenance involved in owning a home. So if you're going to make these new houses, you might as well make it cheaper to maintain them as well. So there's a big push in that in terms of um, when they're building these new affordable housing. Another facet to this whole community economic development is obviously education. So, we've talked about this, that spending on education comes from the tax base. And I have a typo in there, I'm sorry. The tax base is what funds education, right? And the problem is you have, let's say, Milwaukee Public Schools, for example. You know, there's a lot of people in Milwaukee and there's a lot of schools in Milwaukee. The problem is there's not a lot of taxes going into some of those schools because they're in lower income areas, whereas the suburbs have much higher tax bases and pretty much have all the amenities and everything else. And that's a problem actually, and it's been a problem. However, there's federal grants and things like that that are help offsetting that. Um, so that's at least part of it. So in a nutshell, what happens is the school system starts to degrade, so people pull their kids out, further degrading the school system. It's sort of a cyclical, like a snowball effect. And that also erodes the tax base, so there's not as much money coming into the school system. So this is another issue that needs to be solved, and there's no easy fix for this whatsoever because you can't tax people that don't live in that district. It's very complicated that way. I live in Oak Creek, just south of the airport, and I don't want to have to pay for Milwaukee schools because my kids don't go there. I chose to live here. I like living in Oak Creek. And so that's where I live. So my taxes for my house should go to where my kids are going to school. Now, food systems we've talked about quite a bit. And in a community or regional setting, this is where food systems become a huge deal. We've talked about some of this before. In the previous slide we talked about worker cooperatives. This is becoming a thing in some inner city areas where you get what are called food hubs. This does several things. It's with the policies in place that they favor the agro industry and over healthy foods, right? We've already talked about that in chapter, I forgot what chapter it was off the top of my head. um, and that doesn't bode well for areas that don't have access to fresh fruits or vegetables, for example. So that creates what we call those food deserts, and that further complicates things and causes things like the obesity problem. If you don't have access to healthy foods, all you have access to is things like a convenience store where it's all prepackaged processed foods. that's where you're going to get a very unhealthy eating habits. Now, community food systems protect rather than exploit its workers. This goes back to sort of that cooperative type thing. Building urban farms, urban gardens, community gardens that are maintained by a cooperative of people that do several things. Um, it helps get fresh food and fruits and vegetables to those areas that don't have them, but it also creates a sense of community, because you have that equitable access to everything in that community. Now, they could be made more sustainable, and then you could have also other retails that provide healthy, environmentally friendly foods at affordable prices. This is a huge issue. I've read quite a bit about this, and being that I teach GIS in my other classes, like at UWM, there are lots of maps that show these things. It's a problem that's being worked on. So there's ways to get around this, but again, it all starts with building it from the bottom up in these areas, and having the community come together and understand that um, everybody benefits by not only having sort of equitable access to nutritional foods, but doing it sustainably creates sort of that pride effect in terms of being able to maintain it easily and healthy and environmentally friendly. Obviously, healthcare is a huge issue. Um, Community health clinics are dwindling, uh, because somebody has to pay for those. Even though they offer poor and uninsured patients a way to get treatment, somebody has to pay for that, right? Um, Another thing that's becoming, I don't know if this is a COVID related thing, but assistance at home helps prevent illness as well, especially for infant mortality rates. Getting the nurses to get to the homes of people that might not be able to get to a doctor when they're pregnant, to help, because of complications due to pregnancy. So that, home care, things like that. And there's programs for that kind of thing. And then obviously programs to help educate about healthy eating, exercise, safe recreation. That's something that, I take for granted. My kids go to the park and they play. In some areas, you might not want to, send your kids to, and that's a problem as well. So these are kinds of things that need to be handled from a community aspect. It can't be done just with one or two people. It takes the entire community to come together to tackle healthcare and making sure that people understand that taking care of yourself leads to a better life. Now, built in with all of this, and you is understanding such a simple thing, but it goes a long way, is open space. When you're building a sense of community, having open space such as parks, greenways, and gardens are you want that, right? You don't want just a concrete pavement paradise, so to speak, right? And that's a picture of, the lakefront. I drive up that road every day to work up to UWM. That's uh, right along the lakefront there. Now, they offer recreation. There's environmental benefits such as, protecting natural habitats and watershed issues and biodiversity. And there's a lot of people that go down to the parks to walk or run or bike or whatever. It's a gathering place, and you need those. And regardless of whatever community you live in, it's a huge factor is to have some type of space where people can congregate safely and be able to enjoy themselves. Now, one of the problems is that gentrification is that people with money move in, and they're the ones that get direct access to the parks, and you see that quite a bit as well. And you even see that a little bit along the lake, but they've made sure that there's plenty of parking and everybody has access to those parks along the lake there. Now, again, access is influenced by the perceived safety. If you think your kids are going to get, bullied or something like that, you're not going to send them to the park.
So you have to have the park look and feel safe. You don't want it run down looking. You want, you, and that's why and that also negatively affects property values. So if you're trying to reinvigorate, there's that word again, your area, your community, you know, making sure your parks look beautiful and up to date and a place where kids can go and feel safe and have fun, that's a huge step to making everything else go from there. Transportation is another huge factor for community building a regional and community interconnectedness. This is an image from in the back at the tail end of the chapter. I forgot how to pronounce it. It's in Brazil. So they built these arterial roads that go off in all directions with dedicated bus lanes, as you can see there, and they travel in each direction and they have their own lanes. You can't drive in them whatsoever. And something like 20 million people ride these things every year, or something like that. It's crazy. So the idea is having good transportation is a huge step in making a sustainable having sustainable transportation, excuse me. So the buses are running on biodiesel or something like that, or even electric eventually. Um, it offers people the ability to get out, get away from being so reliant on their cars. And obviously that this isn't for everybody. And for me personally, I there's no bus lines near me, the freeway flyers, but that's not convenient for me, unfortunately. There's social benefits such as reduced pollution, increased work, walking and bicycling, and not having to, the stress of riding in a car in rush hour traffic, right? So transportation plays a huge role in both a community and sort of that regional effect in connecting communities together. And if you could do it in a sustainable way, and that, this particular city in Brazil is sort of the gold standard for that. You see these tubes over here on the left side of the image there. That's where the passengers wait for the bus. And I think the buses run like, now you don't see it in this particular image, but they run very, very often at peak times, every minute or two, and they're always full from what if you read the chapter. Another facet to building community and regional sustainability is becoming more self-sufficient using renewable energy. Reducing greenhouse emissions, making energy more affordable, and starting to reduce the effect of climate change. Now, the images that you see on the left there are from the Samso Island in Denmark, which starting in 2005 became completely self-sufficient on renewable energy. One of the first places in the world to do that. Between solar panels and windmills, they've become completely self-sufficient. We'll talk a bit more about these at the tail end of the slides, but I added the images from those particular places here, just to kind of showcase them like I did in the previous slide with the buses from Carbidius. I don't know how to pronounce it, Brazil. So the government sector is taking a lead role on this. So they're retrofitting or building new buildings with sustainable energy in mind, with green roofs and installing um, better lighting, LED lights, everything that you can do to create a more sustainable uh, uh, energy use. I know several years ago at UWM they installed all the light sensors in that. So if nobody's moving around in the hallways, the lights go off, and then if somebody moves, they go back on to help save energy in that regard as well. Now, another thing that they mention in the chapter that would go a long way to doing this is making energy a publicly owned entity, what they call municipalization, has led to more widespread renewable energy. Right now, most of the energy companies, like here in Wisconsin where we are, it's We Energies, right? It's a private company. So they're beholden to the stockholders to make a profit. So it's not in their best interest to spend more money to start that transition to renewable energies. So the federal government is telling them they have to start making their portfolio, the percentage of renewable energy, more and more each year. So they're kind of being forced to do it. Um, but if it was publicly owned, then it would be that way right away. What that does is it becomes a nonprofit entity, which takes that part of it right out, removing the marketing part of it, the executive pay, and shareholders drive for profits. So all of those things keep keep them from switching to renewable energy. And then in some areas, more and more individuals are having the option of, how they get their energy to their individual homes. They can actually bundle things where they say, okay, I want this much energy from renewable with this much energy from traditional, that kind of thing. So it's a slow process, but there are becoming more and more options. And like I said, the government sector is the one taking the lead on this. Now, how do some of these changes come about? Well, civic engagement is always part of that process. It's where the citizens participate in the life of the community in order to change those aspects they want to make a better future. Engaged citizens are more informed, feel more part of that community, and most capable to either directly generate significant change or sustain it through buy-in. Now, how is that done? Typically, it's done through grassroots efforts that eventually ends up as a referendum on a a voting ballot. That's how referendums occur. That you get enough people to sign. Uh, there's That's part of our constitution. If you get enough people to sign up for this idea, you can put it up to a vote by the general public, and then it's up to them whether or not they want to do it. And that's how a lot of things are done in government, with these types of issues. So we're going to look at some new ideas called smart growth, new urbanism, and regional sustainability. These are some new concepts in terms of kind of looking towards the future as to how do we approach things like suburbs, for example, or how do we look at more regional geography in terms of sustainability over a broader scope. So smart growth is a theory that land development that recognizes that growth and development will occur, and therefore you want to figure out ways, if it's going to keep occurring, to make it more sustainable. So yes, growth will be there. There's more people want to move around, people want to move to different areas. That's great. But how do you make that growth sustainable in the process? So this whole idea came out of the massive amount of urban sprawl that occurred between 1982 and 97, where 25 million acres of rural land was converted into subdivisions, roads, and highways. That's huge, 25 million acres. So this image here is an image from Normal, Illinois, which is another example that they use in the book concerning smart growth and open spaces and pathways, which I'll show you in the next talk about in the next slide. So what are the principles of smart growth? And here's some examples you see in the images here. Things like mixed use, clustered land development that locates a range of affordable housing near businesses and places of work. So you're kind of grouping things together. A lot of this comes out of Europe. So in Europe, their cities are sort of compact, right? They're old cities, but they've been updated over the years in place. They're not moving out in all directions. They take what they have and they update it and they make it, more livable. So some of this stems from the ideas coming out of Europe. Provide a variety of transportation options. And you can see that in the lower left there. You have bike lanes, bus lanes, carpool lanes, lots of walkways and things like that. Encourages redevelopment in existing communities or developed land. That's a huge one. So rather than building taking new land and bulldozing it and building new suburbs and developments. Let's take what we have now and either bulldoze it and redevelop it, or just upgrade it, update it, and build on top of it. And then you want to engage the citizens, have the citizens be a part of that sort of redevelopment, and making sure that there's a pride factor then. Hey, we're doing this the right way. You also want to enhance the environment, the economy, and the well-being of the community equally. So, and that goes back to the equitable housing, affordable housing, making sure that everybody gets that sense of, okay, we're in this together. You also want to protect water quality in natural spaces. And okay, water's always there. It's always going to be a thing that is needed by humans for, you have to have water. So making sure that it's taken care of is of the utmost importance, whether it be watershed management, reducing paving. Now, whether you know this or not, all the roads that we have, all that, the highways, the roads, the bridges, everything, that plays a role into how much or how little water gets back into the natural system. The more paving you have, the more that water is being diverted into other systems as opposed to the natural one. And then finally, it offers economic benefits to the municipal system, like budgets. If you're building sustainably, you're spending less on other things. So, for example, it reduces maintenance on roads because you have fewer cars because people are using buses, trains, or bikes or things like that. So there's ancillary effects to the overall how you manage this community because things were done with a bit of pre-planning to keep environmentally sustainable practices in place. The concept of new urbanism is taking those principles that we just talked about of smart growth and then applying them to urban development or redevelopment based on the principles of how cities and towns were built in the past and then learning from it. It focuses on human scale urban development with walkable blocks, streets, housing, and shopping, everything sort of within a close proximity, designed for people. It's not designed for cars. And that's one of the things that plays a huge role in this is getting people to be able to get to places quickly without a car. Another focus is to of redeveloping underutilized land. And obviously, that's a huge part of any urban city. You're always going to have those areas that are sort of old. Maybe they used to be a manufacturing, or they're just run down. And you can think of those places here in Milwaukee, places that could really use a facelift, right? And that's what they're looking at doing with some of these ideas, applying the smart growth principles and then using that as the new urbanism and developing communities from that aspect. Now we're going to take a look at regional sustainability, which makes sense for resources and services that occur over a wider area such as energy, transportation, land use, and agriculture. So we're getting past the community area and taking communities and connecting them together. Part of that is regional transportation systems that connect, um, offering economic and environmental benefits. Now, again, this is a very European model, right? Because of one of the things in America is we have a lot more space than Europe does. So our cities are much further apart than, look at Milwaukee and Madison, for example. Okay. They're the two biggest cities in the state, but they're separated by like 70 miles. And now in other parts of Europe, they might have a high-speed train that connects the two. We have such a huge road system that taking a train to and from Madison doesn't always make sense. But that's the idea of regional sustainability. Another big part of that is land use decisions. Okay, so what is land going to be used for? Is it going to be used for commercial? Is it going to be used for residential? What is it going to be used for? And is it being done equitably? Is there more favoritism towards, the big businesses or low income housing, or affordable housing, I should say. So those things need to be looked at as well. And then obviously food systems on a regional scale,
allow, you need at the community scale, those types of uh, very small farm type things may not be able to supply food over a regional scale. And that's sometimes where you have this idea of the food hub, where you're pooling agricultural resources together and allows for more affordable prices and allows those that food hub to sort of spread out in all directions into new larger volume markets. Then it's a win-win for everybody. So everybody in the region gets access, equitable access to the fruits and vegetables that are grown locally, grown sustainably, at affordable prices. Whenever you talk about these concepts, there's always going to be barriers to as to why these aren't already in place. Most of these are great ideas and they should be implemented. You know, it seems like a no-brainer. However, obviously, there's always going to be barriers to these types of things, and we've talked about barriers to almost every aspect that we've handled this semester, whether it be garbage or education or whatever it is. There's always barriers. You have to talk about what we need to overcome in order to get to this point. Now, one of the things that really spurred all of this suburban sprawl is the way the federal government handles the financing of loans. So those loans tend to limit financing on real large buildings. They don't want to take the risk on a real large building, but they'll take the risk on tons and tons of single family housing. So it's kind of a weird concept in that regard. And on top of that, there's the mortgage reduction program that makes it easier to purchase a house in the suburbs with better financial incentives than it would be to purchase a home for less money and then renovate it. And in the book, they use that example. If I'm going to spend $150,000 on a house in the suburbs, it makes more financial sense for me to do it that way because I get a bigger tax break on that loan than to spend $50,000 on a home in, let's say, not in a nice, not as nice area, and then sink $100,000 into that home. I don't get all of the tax breaks when I do it that way. So that also led to the suburban sprawl. On top of that, you have all the subsidies from things like, fossil fuels, roads, and energy that just, it doesn't, other than maybe your commute to work, it doesn't hinder you from moving out to the suburbs. The price of electricity costs the same in a suburb than it does downtown. So there's no downside with all of the subsidies taking place to moving out to the suburbs. In order to build a more regional community, sustainable community, it takes a huge investment in the infrastructure. And while everybody knows this, the price tag becomes astronomically high to get it to a level that would benefit everybody, including, repairing roads, bridges, and highways, your water systems and waste management systems. What said in the book, it would cost roughly $863 billion. That's almost $1 trillion to get to the bare level to get everything up to date. And the problem with that is not only do we need all this money to fix all this stuff, the amount of spending has actually declined over the years. All right. So by not making the improvements, it costs businesses money. And in the book, they talk about, oh, it's about $27 billion a year in freight costs with things like trucks sitting in construction zones, getting stuck and having to reroute and everything else. $27 billion alone, $33 billion in power outages a year, and then $120 billion in fuel spending from sitting in traffic. That's a huge number. So if you take all of three of those numbers, you could go a long way in repairing the infrastructure to get it to a point where those things would start to be alleviated. The problem is nobody likes to talk about it. Nobody likes the price tag. It's not the sexy thing to do when it comes to budgets and budgetary decisions. It's an absolutely economic necessity. Me working downtown, I remember when they redid the Marquette interchange. Man, what a pain in the butt that was, right? Oh God, it took what, 3, 4 years to finish that thing, whatever it was. But you know what? Now that it's done, it's awesome.
Same thing with the zoo interchange. The zoo interchange took even longer, and I think there's some political crap going on in there, but that took quite a while. But now that it's done, it's awesome. You very rarely get any type of delays going through that interchange anymore. So investment in infrastructure, while the price tag is massive, it's definitely something that needs to be done to increase, regional sustainability. Now, there are corporate barriers and corruption that also take place. You can't talk about these type of projects. you know, there's a lot of people out there that fight the halt of progress because it's in their best interest to not have renewable energy. It's best to not have privatizing water resources and agriculture. So they fight it with lobbies and politicians. And that's unfortunately the way business is done in the United States or around the world, I'm sure as well. Now, there's this thing called crony capitalism that's been taking place for years, where a business that stems the gain from policies that involve public funding, what they'll do is they'll be favoritism in the distribution of contracts, permits, or special tax breaks given out to a company that is going to benefit from that. So if I'm a construction company and I know I found some insider information that this particular project's going to get done, I know I'll get the bid because the politician is a friend of mine and this and that. That's where things can get kind of and crazy, and people have gotten in big trouble, jail time, and everything else for doing this kind of thing, both on the politician side and on the business side of things. So unfortunately, it takes place. No one likes it, but the idea is to try to be as transparent as possible in this process. There are also cultural barriers that need to be overcome in order for these types of both community and regional sustainability practices to be put in place. In America, it's the land of the free, home of the brave, right? Well, the key word being is free. We are staunchly individuals in this country. We have a tendency to be lone wolves. We want to do things on our own, and these ideas of worker cooperatives and things like that are a bit foreign to people who have a tendency that believe in the idea of working hard to get what they want. Sometimes it does take a community to get things done. And the other part of that is the distrust of government or social programs even though they are effective. And you see this quite a bit in the news. Um, it feels like everybody's getting a handout, even though the handout might be really benefiting and trickling down into other effects that you may or may not see. We only hear maybe one side of that story. But that doesn't mean that the program isn't working. It's just that you don't hear about all of the other parts of it. And that's a huge issue in this country is, only hearing half the story, so to speak. Now, removing barriers to community and regional sustainability is no easy task, right? And that's where all of these aspects, the smart growth principles, the new urbanism, looking at everything from affordable housing to education, all of these things play a role in removing those barriers. Now, is it a perfect system? No, but there are some examples, and that's what I'm going to show you now that from the book of places, and I've already shown you some pictures of these, where they have overcome some of these barriers to start building these types of regional and community sustainable practices. So, like I mentioned earlier, the Curbe, Curbita, Brazil, looking at their transportation system. So they've overcome this by building these arterial roads that go off in like 5 different directions that connect communities, not just in the thousands, but in the millions, using these buses, dedicated buses with their own lanes. No one can drive in them. A one fare payment, so you can transfer any time with only one fare. It's privately operated. It's not even owned by the government. It's privately operated. It's user funded, and there are no government subsidies. and it moves around millions of people a year. And I mentioned before, in another example is Amsterdam. They've developed a waste to energy system that's 100% clean energy that powers all government buildings and produces biogas from the sewage sludge. It creates other materials from its recovered wastes, like things like concrete, calcium. And then if you read through the book, another thing that they have that was pretty interesting is underground waste. So they don't take their garbage and put it out to the road like I do today to get my garbage picked up. They have an underground system with where they dump their uh, garbage sort of down like a laundry chute, right? Down a chute, it goes into a waste bin, and that gets emptied every once in a while. So you don't even, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind, but it's done in such a way that, and then they take that and then they use it for other energy sources. So it's a very, very clean system. And then I mentioned the Samso Island, where they're 100% self-sufficient with renewable energy, with wind and solar, and geothermal for heat. And then now they generate so much that they sell it back to Denmark, sort of the national energy council, so to speak. So they're actually profiting from becoming self-sufficient. And that's a great, great success story right there. And then the last one is the Noto Japan agriculture, which this one I thought was pretty interesting. So it was this area is in the northern section of the main island of Japan, and it was identified as a threatened agricultural system. And there's a world entity that noticed this, and so they've been given some help to maintain the diversity of crops that are being grown along with the traditional techniques to create sustainable farms. So what in Japan, farming is becoming basically a thing of the past. In the book, they mention that the average farmer age is like 65 years old. Most of the people live in urban areas. And in fact, Japan has almost no farmland. So they import everything. So think of this as sort of a endangered species of sorts, but it's farms. So what this world entity saw was that, hey, not only do we need to protect the farmland, but we need to protect the crops that are grown on that because they're historically significant and culturally significant, but let's not also take those crops and maintain them sustainably. So it's sort of this triple thing of making sure they're sustainable, making sure the techniques are sort of traditional, and maintaining the farmland itself, making sure that farmland does not get sort of paved over with, more urban sprawl. So I thought that was pretty interesting as well, and I'm sure there's some other examples around the world of this. If you look through the examples, for example, of the smart growth principles, those are all actually most of those are in America. There's one in Virginia, there's Normal, Illinois, there's one in Colorado, um, but these examples here are much more regional in terms of like a much broader area, and these European and South American and Japanese, they sort of bought into this, and that's the hardest. Well, always throughout the semester we've talked about the buy-in. You have to get people to buy into these concepts, and it starts at the local level, the people that live there, building that into the local governments and everything else to get them to buy into these particular concepts as well. Okay, so that's it for chapter 11, looking at the community and regional level. And chapter 12, we're going to go global. That's going to be the last chapter for the semester, and I will see you on the next one. Take care. Bye.